Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History, number 21, the Crimean War, 1854 to 56, part 2. And I don't seem to have any guests at the moment, but we'll see if anyone turns up while I'm playing our introductory song.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new gods sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love and heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, a loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come down to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. If you like good music, do go and check out his YouTube channel. He's got some really good tunes on there. Good evening, Mitch. How are you going?
Same old, same old.
We're not going to have AI this week since he just sent me a message that he can't make it. People will have seen part one of this stream, which AI was a member of, which covered most of the background to the Crimean War between 1854 and 1856. So we can probably get more or less straight into it, I suppose, Mitch. Basically, the Crimean War actually broke out at the end of 1853. By this time, British troops had already been sent to the Balkans and had run cavalry patrols to the Varna River and what have you, which was a bit of a disaster, by the way. Lord Cardigan, the light cavalry brigade commander, was put in charge of it, and he made his men ride too much. And British cavalry were quite well known for walking almost as much as they rode, which tended to keep their horses in good condition. But Cardigan, in his lack of wisdom, did not do this, and ended up with a lot of horses with sore backs when he came back from this patrol. And it was actually nicknamed the Sore Back Patrol because of the number of horses it ruined. The British government, obviously, as we were saying last week, from Britain's point of view, the main point of the Crimean War was to keep the Russian Navy out of the Mediterranean. This was the main thing that Britain was interested in. They didn't really much care about the rivalry between Roman Catholic monks and Orthodox monks in Jerusalem, which had somewhat influenced the Tsar and Napoleon III, because they were the respective protectors of those groups. Britain didn't really give a shit about that sort of stuff, but we were interested in keeping the Russian Navy out of the Mediterranean. In the 1820s, of course, the Russian Navy had joined with the Royal Navy and the French Navy in supporting Greek independence from Turkey. But that was in the 1820s, and things had somewhat changed since then. In particular, in naval terms, you had the steam revolution, which meant that not all, but most major warships tended to have auxiliary steam engines by 1854, or by 1853, in fact. So this was Britain's major object. Mitch, anything to say about the Russian side of stuff just before the war started?
In terms of Russian naval stuff, I mean, nothing I didn't say last week regarding like certain treaties, like the one where on Kiosk Gillespie, where the Russians tried to monopolize the Black Sea, which of course causes a massive stink with us. And yeah, I would say like the Russians, they were able to defeat the Turkish Navy at the Battle of Sinop under Pavel Nakhimov, but fighting against our Navy, yeah, Russians, the Russians aren't known for having a naval tradition like we do.
Yeah, the Russian Navy the Black Sea Fleet really thoroughly defeated the Turkish Navy at Sinope. It was known in Britain as the Massacre of Sinope, which is ridiculous because it was simply a naval battle. But it was something of a massacre because the Russian Navy had bigger warships for the most part than the Turks. And they were also using, for the first time in a major naval battle, shell guns. So instead of firing solid iron shot, as HMS Victory, for example, did at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, by the mid-19th century, warships were firing explosive shells, and these things would literally rip a wooden warship to pieces. It was partly this that led to the ironclads that we were to see from about 1859 onwards. But yeah, as Mitch correctly says, the Russian Navy totally destroyed the Turkish Black Sea Navy, which led to the Royal Navy and the French Navy going into the Black Sea. Obviously, the Turks, who control the Dardanelles were quite happy to see them arrive because Turkey was a traditional enemy of Russia. They'd been fighting for a long time, and Russia generally had come out on top rather than the Turks. Britain's support of Turkey in the 19th century, as I say, really had nothing to do with their religion or anything else. It was really just to keep the Russians out of the Mediterranean. So Britain, the army that had been sent to Turkish territory from Britain, was under the command of a chap called Lord Raglan. Now, Raglan had spent most of his career as the Duke of Wellington's military secretary. He was a very brave man. He lost an arm at the Battle of Waterloo, and as the surgeon was, and of course no anesthetic back then, so the surgeon amputated his arm. And as the surgeon was walking away with it, Raglan asked him to bring it back because there was a ring on the finger that his wife had given him that he wanted to keep, obviously. So Raglan was a very brave man, but he didn't have a great deal of experience of actually commanding troops. As I say, he'd spent most of his military career acting as Wellington's military secretary, which required you to be brave because when Wellington was in battles, he was always where the fighting was fiercest, but it didn't really set you up for commanding an army. And by the 1850s, of course, Raglan, who'd been a young man during the Peninsular War, was getting on a bit, shall we say, as quite a few of the British commanders were, it has to be said. This really didn't matter if they were young and vigorous and good commanders. Raglan was not really, to be honest, and there's no reason why he should have been. As I say, he hadn't spent his career commanding troops, really. He was told by the government that they needed to invade the Crimean Peninsula, which I've put a map up of on the screen, which was and is the main Russian naval base in the Black Sea, which is situated at Sevastopol, as it still is. And he was basically told to capture and destroy this naval base, and that the French would cooperate with him. Now, the British army that was sent to the Crimea was an extremely good army. In terms of the first expeditionary force, there were about 25,000 men organized in 5 infantry divisions. They were quite small divisions. Each division was only 2 brigades. Each brigade was only 3 battalions, and there was a battery of Royal Field Artillery in each division. There was also a cavalry division, which consisted of 2 brigades, the light cavalry brigade and the heavy cavalry brigade. Eventually, the heavy cavalry brigade only landed later, but eventually the 2 brigades would each consist of 5 cavalry regiments, each of 2 squadrons, which again is quite small, with a Royal Horse Artillery battery. In fact, I think it was 2 Royal Horse Artillery batteries. Each division also had a company of the Rifle Brigade. Both battalions of the Rifle Brigade were sent to the Crimea, and a company was given to each, at least a company was given to each British infantry brigade to act as skirmishers, although it is important to recall that one huge advantage the British and French had is that most of their troops were armed with the mini rifled musket. This was a muzzle loader, but it was a rifled muzzle loader. It would later see extensive service in the American Civil War, and it gave infantry a much more deadly weapon than the smoothbore muskets. A smoothbore musket had an effective range of about 150 yards at the most, With a mini rifle, you could absolutely kill the enemy at 400 yards, and even at longer ranges for mass troops. It was so long range that it actually meant that infantry could snipe artillery guys with smoothbore artillery. And it had quite a considerable effect on the war, particularly because most of the Russian army didn't have rifles. There were rifle regiments in the Russian army, and quite a few of them did fight in the Crimea. But the majority of the Russian infantry was still armed with smoothbore muskets, which meant their firepower was ineffective over about 150 yards. The Russians also tended to favor the column, as did the French, over the British, who still, of course, were using their famous two-deep line that had been so successful in the Napoleonic Wars. And this was still an advantage for the British. It was quite late in the year when the government decided that Britain was going to invade the Crimea. And the Crimea was noted for not always having a very nice climate in the winter. It could get jolly cold there. And Raglan and his senior divisional commanders and his senior Royal Engineer, a chap called Sir John Burgoyne, considered what they should do, because it was so late in the year when the Allied armies were going to land in the Crimean Peninsula. And they came to the conclusion that if Raglan refused to invade that year and said it's too late in the year, we'll invade in the spring, which would have been the sensible thing to do, Raglan and his senior commanders came to the conclusion that the government would simply replace Raglan with somebody else who would do as they were told. And so, against his own inclinations, Raglan agreed to invade. So the Royal Navy and the French Navy picked up the British and French forces. The French had about 30,000 soldiers in the same place. And initially, something like 8,000 Turks also accompanied them. And this army was conveyed by the Allied fleets into the Black Sea, and they landed at a place called Eupatoria, as you can see on the map that's on the screen. Mitch, anything to say from the Russian side of things?
One thing I would say is that the Russian army, the Crimea was more of a naval base. It wasn't really an army base in that sense. So you had a situation where, when it came to logistics, I believe one of the closest military settlements was a place called Taganrog, which was like far to the northeast of Crimea. Like it's modern day Russia, and it's like somewhat like east of the borders of Ukraine. That kind of area. Like it's in the Sea of Azov area, and you have a situation where when you have the Russians having to deal with the main guys who are dealing with any Allied forces landing were the Cossacks. I believe like the first British casualty was a guy called George Priestley, who got his leg shot off by a Cossack when landing on the shores of around nearby the area of Yevpatoria or Eupatoria. I'm going to pronounce it Yevpatoria, but that's how the Russians will say it in their language, whereas we spell it differently because
Fair enough.
Greek names are spelled differently compared to how they spell it in English.
It's worth pointing out that on the map that I put up there, it's called Sevastopol, which I believe is what it's called these days. But at the time, the British called it Sebastopol. So,
yeah, it's probably. I think it's like because some of those place names, like you got Theodosia, which the Turks would call Kefe. So some of the names were a bit iffy. Like let's say we say one letter slightly wrong because we misheard it, or it's like, for example, how we used to call Bombay Mumbai because basically we misheard the locals, same with city name, and the name could just got stuck. Same with Sevastopol. Like it probably was. We heard a Russian say it, and we thought they said the letter B, when it actually turns out to be the letter V. But by the time we found out, it was a bit too late to change spelling. So
that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I do know as Mitch was saying, the Russian military didn't have a great advantage, even though the Crimean Peninsula was part of Russia. As Mitch says, it wasn't particularly a military area; it was a naval base. Obviously, there were troops there to defend the naval base, and obviously there were also all the sailors from the fleet who were used as gunners and what have you. But the Russian army had to do very long marches to actually get into the Crimea. And of course, the Royal Navy and the French Navy absolutely dominated the Black Sea. The Russian fleet basically went into port, sunk some of her ships as block ships across the entrance to the harbour so that British and French vessels couldn't get in there, and then took the sailors off the ships and basically used them as part of the garrison. And there was very, very little naval action during the Crimean War. What naval action there was British and French ships bombarding Russian shore establishments and what have you. Sorry, Mitch, carry on.
Yeah, another thing was so the main railways you had, I think about time you would have a Moscow to St. Petersburg and a railway from Moscow to Kiev. But to get from Kiev into Crimea, you'd have to go for that northern, what would you call it, like a spit, or like
you had to march, and you had to march from Kiev. There's quite a few accounts of Royal Navy warships engaging Russian columns that were marching close to the coast on their way to get to the Crimea. And the Russians actually lost quite a few soldiers marching them to the Crimea, particularly in the winter, which was quite a bad winter in 1854.
Yeah, and that's why the Russian army, they have to depend upon basically the same pathways as what the average gold herder would have to use. So you'd have a situation where, let's say, on a Battle of the Alma, and Russian soldiers are having to spend it takes days just for the Russian soldiers to be wheeled on cart to get to back to their lines to receive medical treatment.
Yep.
By which time they probably would have died from exposure to the elements, or especially in the winter, you'd have situations where, let's say, yeah, that's another thing is like a lot of the Russian soldiers, especially in Sevastopol during the siege, they didn't have winter clothing either, like the British soldiers. So
yep.
A lot of the suffering about British soldiers, like a lot of what you hear of British soldiers suffering, the Russians also were suffering, because you got a factor that a lot of the Russian soldiers serving in this area, they don't come from northern Russia where they can deal with really cold winters. They come from the south, like Sochi or Ukraine or southern Russia, where it's largely agricultural, warm weather kind of area, kind of like more Mediterranean climate, akin to Crimea.
Absolutely, and the Crimea is infamous for the breakdown in British logistics and medical services, but the Russian medical services, as Mitch points out, were probably even worse, actually.
It depends, because there's a guy called Nikolai Pirogov who he brings in some innovations like triage, and also in some of like stuff like amputations. You'd have a situation where, let's say, actually you stood a better chance of surviving an amputation in a Russian military hospital than you did with let's say, average British Army hospital, especially in early stages of the war. However, there's a lot of corruption to be had. Like you'd have doctors selling up high quality drugs, and then they'd say, okay, well, you want me to give you some anesthetic for your pain? Oh, you're gonna have to pay me, or they'll give you low quality drugs. That was always a pervasive problem throughout the war. So it's kind of like it was really mixed, the variation, where either you had a really good doctor or you had a really terrible one on the Russian side.
That makes sense. And of course, most of the Russian troops were conscripted serfs. I mean, there were some volunteers in the Russian army, but most of the rank and file were conscripts. The British Army, which caused its own problems that I'll talk about in a bit, was long service regulars who were volunteers. And the French Army was a mixture of conscripts and volunteers. The Allies, as I said, landed at Eupatoria late in 1854. And when they got ashore, it started pissing down with rain. As Mitch correctly pointed out, there were Cossack patrols who were watching the Allies land. The Russians couldn't do a lot about it because it was covered by the guns of the Allied fleet. But they certainly knew when the Allies landed and started setting up their position at the River Alma, which was to be the first major battle of the campaign. Not the first skirmish, but the first battle. The Allies came ashore. The French, who were fairly professional, came ashore with their tents d'abri, which means they were small tents that every soldier carried a bit of. And so they were able to set these things up quite quickly. The British, of course, had no tents initially and were sitting around being very miserable in the rain. The army, it took them about 48 hours for everyone to get ashore and then to organize. And then the army set off with the British marching on the left flank and the French on the right flank. So the French were covered by the British army. And this was mainly because the British army had some cavalry. And at this stage, the French hadn't managed to land any. So the British took the inland side because that meant their horsemen could give them some reconnaissance and coverage. There were a couple of skirmishes. There was a skirmish at the Balkanak River between some of the British light cavalry and some Cossacks. Very indecisive. A couple of guys on each side were either killed or wounded. Nothing much happened. And then the Allied army continued their march towards the River Alma, where they knew that the main Russian field army was waiting for them. And the Russians in the Napoleonic Wars have become quite famous for building field works. Like the people will probably know of the entrenchments and things that the Russians put up at Borodino in 1812. And the Russians had done the same thing at the Alma. They built entrenchments for their guns that also had infantry in them and what have you. And they were on some quite high hills overlooking the Alma River. And basically the British and French armies had to defeat them if they were going to continue their march towards Sevastopol. And to be honest, mostly the British, the French took part in the battle, but their part was more limited than the British. The immediately close to the sea where the French were, the cliffs were much steeper than inland. And so there were only certain tracks that the French could get up to get near to the Russian positions. Whereas in front of the British, it was kind of low sweeping hills with these Russian entrenchments on the top and big masses of Russian infantry. It's worth pointing out that the Allied army was probably a considerable sight to see because the British were in their full splendor of scarlet jackets and what have you for their infantry. And the French, of course, in those days wore blue with red trousers. In fact, they were still wearing blue with red trousers in 1914. So it would have been quite a sight to see these 50-odd thousand soldiers in close order marching across the countryside. The Russian army at the Alma were still wearing their tall spiked helmets, which looked a bit like the Russian Pickelhaube helmet, but was a bit taller. And the Russians also tended to wear their greatcoats in action. So although the Russians wore green jackets and what have you, the majority of the soldiers were actually wearing these big brown and grey greatcoats over their uniforms while in action, and they did all through the Crimean War. If you look at illustrations of the Russians during the Crimean War, they're not particularly colourful, mostly except for the cavalry. And this was because Russian troops tended to fight in their greatcoats. So, Battle of the Alma, the British Army, they got a bit disordered because in front of the Russian position there were quite a lot of vineyards, and because trees were in short supply in that part of the world, the way the Russians grew their vines was in pits, which also gave the vines some protection from the winter weather, I suppose. But it also was quite bad for troops in close order because it disordered them to get through these things. And so the British lines that were going up the heights towards the Russian positions at Alma after they crossed the river got quite disordered from these vineyards. There were also Russian riflemen and snipers who used it as cover initially, although the British Rifle Brigade guys were able to clear them out. And as I say, all the British divisions in the Crimea except one had the Minet rifle. One British division still had the old Brown Bess musket, although it was a percussion musket by this stage. But that division didn't play much part at Alma. It was mainly the mini-armed troops. And the Russians were swept away by the British rifle fire at ranges that were beyond the ability of most of their muskets to reply effectively at. Obviously, the Brits got closer eventually, and in order to eject the Russians from positions, you have to do a bayonet charge in the end. And the Brits lost quite a lot of troops. I think the British losses were about 350 men at the Battle of the Alma, killed, and probably twice that many wounded. The Russian losses were much higher, and the French losses were quite a bit smaller. As I say, the French did take part in the battle, but only some of their troops did, and quite late on after they found ways up the steep coastal cliffs to get to the Russian position. There was a bit of a mess up at first. The first British troops captured the main Russian redoubt, and then a staff officer, and no one ever managed to identify this person, was seen riding across the front because the Russians counterattacked, saying, don't fire, they're French." And so the British troops, who were somewhat confused, and the company officers, who were also somewhat confused, didn't fire on this column. And as a result, the Russians chucked the Brits out of the redoubt. However, then the Guards and Highlanders came up, who had been in reserve, and they recaptured the redoubt quite quickly, again using mini rifle fire and then a bayonet charge. And the Russians ended up losing about 800 killed or something like that at the Alma, as opposed to the 350 or so that the Brits lost, and probably about 100 French. The Russian army then fell back on Sevastopol, which, as you can see in the maps, quite close to the Alma. Mitch, anything to say from the Russian side of things about the Battle of the Alma, etc.?
Yeah, I believe up until this point, the Russians were underestimating us. Like they were thinking that because the Russians were of a mind of, oh well, the British just have a small army, we should be able to chase them off with our numbers, and and there was always that, like, it's kind of like similar to the Germans in the First World War in terms of having a lot of contempt for the British army. And then once the mini rifles were used, that kind of really shook many Russian soldiers to really start taking us seriously. And the Russians were not expecting us. Menshikov, Menshikov was the main guy commanding the Russian side of a battle, and he ended up at one point, I believe he ended up running because he ended up absconding from a battle. So in the later stages of a battle, you just had Russian soldiers just like not being given explicit orders to retreat. So you had some Russian losses. because well, it was just you had Menshikov and his staff who just ran away before they gave orders for pulling back. And it was mainly a matter of Menshikov. He was in Sevastopol. He was saying, "Oh, look at me! I only have to. If I sally out with my army, I will beat these British and I'll force them out." And he had massive egg on his face. So that was a main reason why Menshikov ended up absconding. And
yeah, Menshikov didn't like the Turks. He'd been fighting them years and years ago, and I believe he'd lost at least one of his testicles to a Turkish musket or cannonball, one or the other. But yeah, the Alma was not the victory that it could have been. As Mitch was saying, the Russians ended up retreating from Alma in some disarray. And the British light cavalry brigade, the heavy cavalry hadn't yet been landed, but the British light cavalry brigade wanted to pursue them. And, normally if you win a battle and the enemy runs away, that's what you do. You pursue them so they can't get all these troops into Sevastopol, which the Allies were going to have to try and capture. But one of Raglan's one of his peculiarities, shall we say, was that he had completely taken on board the Duke of Wellington's distrust of British cavalry. And in the Peninsular War and at Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington never trusted his cavalry, unlike his infantry. The British cavalry in the Napoleonic era had a tendency to charge fearlessly at the French. And they would quite often win the initial charge, but then they would, the officers would lose control of their men, or the officers themselves would go too far, and they wouldn't rally their troops. They wouldn't keep a reserve. And so Wellington, for example, always said that he was quite happy to watch one British squadron taking on one French squadron. But whenever it was a couple of regiments facing each other, he always thought the French would win, because the French used to keep control of their cavalry and also keep a reserve and all this kind of sensible stuff. So Raglan had absolutely taken this on board. And despite the fact that the British cavalry in the 1850s was much more disciplined than it had been under Wellington, it was much better trained. Had very good horses. The British had always had very good horses, even in the Peninsula. But the British cavalry of the Victorian army was actually much better trained than it had been under Wellington. But Raglan did not believe this, and he was always determined to keep his British cavalry in what he called a bandbox. He didn't want to let them do anything too risky. And this was going to come back and bite him in the arse at the Battle of Balaclava. But anyway, so the British cavalry sat there and just watched the Russians retreating into back towards Sevastopol and did not attack them, which obviously would have meant half the Russian army wouldn't have got into the naval base. Now, at the naval base, the Russians had been busily fortifying this thing, but there wasn't a lot there when the Allies came in sight of it. One British general described it as a low park wall that was surrounding it. A new Russian general, a guy called Todleben, who was a Baltic German, I believe, he was an engineering officer, and he was to perform miracles in Sevastopol and fortify the place very, very strongly. But this hadn't yet happened immediately after Alma. But anyway, the British and French, Raglan, and the French commander, who was a guy called Saint-Honard, who was dying of cancer, looked at the Sevastopol defenses, and for reasons best known to themselves, instead of immediately assaulting it, which probably would have been the least expensive thing to do, decided to march around the place to arrive at places where they could find harbors for the Allied navies to supply them. And so they did this flank march going around Sevastopol. And at one stage, the British commander-in-chief, Raglan, was almost captured because he blundered into some of the Russian baggage actually going into Sevastopol. But fortunately, his escort, which I think was the 8th Hussars, the Royal Irish Hussars, charged the Russian baggage. And the Russians, not realizing there weren't many troops there, and also that it was the British commander-in-chief, just buggered off and went into Sevastopol. But Raglan could have been captured at this stage if he'd have been less lucky. So anyway, the Allied army marches around Sevastopol. The Brits take Balaclava as their base, which was a small port. It was a very narrow port, which meant it was well protected from the weather, but it was also very quickly overcrowded. And things got into a huge mess there, with supplies being landed, not properly sorted out, etc., etc. The French took 2 other harbours a bit further along the coast, which were less well protected than Balaclava, but were bigger, which served them quite well. The British settled down on the right, the French on the left. Remember, at this stage, the armies were roughly equal in size. The British army, by this time, they also landed the Heavy Cavalry Brigade, which was like the Light Cavalry Brigade, made up of 5 regiments, each with 2 squadrons. Heavy Cavalry were Dragoons and Dragoon Guards. The Light Cavalry were Hussars, Light Dragoons, and also the 17th Lancers. And Lancers had only been introduced into the British Army after the Battle of Waterloo, partly because we had seen how effective the French Lancers were. So anyway, the Allies then settled down for a siege. And again, there were British generals who were saying to Raglan, let's just assault the bloody place. There's not much there. As I say, effectively, there was a low wall. There were 1 or 2 forts, most of which were really covering the seaward approaches to Sevastopol. So, they could fire on warships, but they weren't greatly useful for firing on troops. But the Russians were furiously digging in. And instead of assaulting the place, Raglan said, no, the French and I are going to land our siege trains of heavy guns, and we're going to lay siege to this place. And that's what they did. Mitch?
Yeah, this is one thing that the Russians were surprised at, why the British why we didn't immediately storm into Sevastopol, because we would have taken it fairly easy, even Russians, after the Battle of Alma, as well as later battles like Inkerman. It'd be a situation where the Russians around Sevastopol, they were so demoralized. If we assaulted the place, Sevastopol would have fallen in short order. It would have.
Yep. Almost certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the walls were something like 5 foot tall at that point. But it wasn't well fortified on the landward side. So to storm a place, it was one of the things where Raglan and the French guy, whose name I can't remember, they were. Yeah, so the thing was, the French, Napoleon III, he gave explicit orders to his guys saying, look, do not attack unless you're absolutely sure that you are going to win, but also attack so that you are casualty averse, which you get back to Napoleon, he's a new guy in power. He doesn't want a massive death toll to impact his short reign in France thus far. However, it does rob initiative from his guys on the ground. So that's the main reason. I don't know about why Lord Raglan hesitated, but certainly on the French side, that's why they hesitated. And also because I believe at this point, because when the French landed, they were quite well organised, with their tents and so on. But after battles like the Alma, the French actually are a lot more disorganised. They haven't got all their men in sharp order in their regiments, and also the French officers, they're in that position where, as I said, they don't know whether to storm Sevastopol or whether to try and besiege it. because they're still in that mindset of we need to be casualty averse as per Napoleon's orders.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the way to keep casualties down would have been to storm the damn place straight away, rather than fight a 2 years, an 18-month siege, which is what they end up doing. Spoiler alert. Yeah, so the and of course the other thing is that when the Allied troops besieged Sevastopol, they never really totally surrounded it ever. Initially, because they didn't have enough troops, but they never got around to totally surrounding the place, which meant that the Russians were always able to march people in from the far side of Sevastopol. And of course, again, the Allied armies weren't anywhere near large enough to occupy the whole of the Crimea. They were only occupying the little corner between Yalta and Balaclava on the map.
Yeah, and the thing is, so I can't remember which battle was someone talking about, probably Balaclava, but like, so you have Simferopol, which that was like the main supply hub for supplying Sevastopol, which even meant like they were still having supply problems. Like even early on in the siege, they were having to be in a position where, when they're dealing with the first winter, the main source of food is dead oxen all over the countryside because of basically the weather. And we just get like rotten salted beef, basically being the main Russian food stuff for the garrison in Sevastopol. So even when like they had a somewhat open channel, their supply situation wasn't exactly good. But also the Russians, they were terrified of that our forces could take Simferopol and confirm that encirclement. But the Russians, they were just surprised that we never did that. I don't know why we never got around to taking Simferopol. Because had we done so, that would have sped up the capture. It would have demoralised defenders.
Initially, Mitch, and for the first, most of the first year of the war, the British British and French didn't even go into the Sea of Azov. And if you look on the map on the screen, the Sea of Azov is the big body of water on the top right. The Russians were actually able to use that to send boats across with supplies, and they didn't even send warships into that initially. Why, I have no idea, but they didn't.
It is History March explained in my video, and I'm going off a book over the Cynical. A lot of his stuff was just haphazard. So we wanted to strike a blow towards the Russians, but we didn't know where. For example, we could have sent troops to the Baltic, but the French weren't keen on it. I can't remember why, but just not. We didn't want to send troops to the Far East because, the Russian Far East, but you didn't have a Trans-Siberian Railway in most days, so it would be no point. And we're not going to send troops into the White Sea, I believe it is, like Arkhangelsk from the north, because that would basically bottleneck troops. So we ended up doing Crimea, but there was just a matter of there wasn't really a good, even just short-term plan of what to do. It was just all very haphazard. It was just all about trying to pick battlefields where, okay, we are in and out. Like the original plan, for example, was just us storm into Sevastopol, burn the harbour, burn anything militarily useful, and then pull out. But Raglan and French, I still can't pronounce his name. Just divered.
Centenard.
Yeah, they just divered.
They did. We might as well talk briefly about the other theatres of the war. The Royal Navy did send a squadron to attack the Russian naval base in the Far East, but it was quite weak, and the senior British captain, the Commodore of the force, ended up shooting himself. He committed suicide. So that turned out to be a bit of a damp squib. But although, as Mitch pointed out, there was no Trans-Siberian Railway in those days, so there weren't major Russian forces in the Far East. We did send a major fleet into the Baltic with Royal Marines and some French ships as well. and began, first of all, we swept up all the Russian merchant ships that were available in the Baltic. The Russian fleet, again, didn't come out because it didn't fancy its chances of winning. And so it remained in Kronstadt and St. Petersburg and the naval bases around that part of the Baltic and didn't come out. The Royal Navy did attack some of the coastal and island fortresses of the Russians in the Baltic. Not particularly successful the first year. We did also send some forces up to the White Sea that Mitch was mentioning, but they were small frigates and what have you. And again, they were basically capturing Russian merchant ships and what have you. Not particularly serious. But the Royal Navy effort in the Baltic was pretty large. There was quite a big fleet sent there. And as I say, the first year, it was successful in stopping basically all Russian merchant trade in the Baltic. And it did cause their fleet to bottle itself up in harbour. But it didn't do a great deal of damage to them the first year. But we'll come back to that because the second year in the Baltic was much more successful, partly because the French sent quite a lot of troops there this time. The French army was much larger than the British army, obviously, whereas the British had the much larger navy. And most of the British land forces available in the Baltic were Royal Marines for the most part. Anyway, they were a bit more successful in the second year, but we'll come back to that after we've talked about the other major battles in the Crimean War. But to understand the war, you do have to realize that the Allied army was only in that sort of bottom corner of the Crimea, and the rest of it was still under Russian control, and the Russians were able to march troops pretty much as they wanted through the place. As Mitch pointed out, they had their own supply difficulties, and the Allied armies weren't actually short of supplies because they had major naval forces who could move them there and big merchant marines, particularly in the British case. The problems started when the supplies got to Balaclava and were offloaded and distributing them to the troops. One of the things that had happened to the British Army in the long peace between Waterloo and the outbreak of the Crimean War, the British Army had fought in various places around the world, including Canada, a lot in India, and also in South Africa and what have you. So the British Army had seen action, but it had been pretty small scale apart from in India. And of course, the Indian campaigns were based on the establishment of the Honourable East India Company with British regiments who were based there helping them. So the Indian situation was pretty separate from the British Army. And they were the most experienced military guys in the British Army, were guys who'd fought in India against the Sikhs and what have you. But most of those guys were not in the army we sent to the Crimea. The problem with the British army that we sent to the Crimea was it was a very fine army, long service professional soldiers who were all volunteers. Many of them had been in the army for more than a dozen years, sometimes almost 20 years in the cases of NCOs. But there were few British reserves. And because it was a long service army, you couldn't really build up reserves. This was going to come back to haunt the British during the Crimean War when they started losing a lot of guys in the winter. Mostly, it has to be said, to supply problems and disease rather than the Russians. But anyway, this would eventually come back to bite them. But the British had set up defenses around their main supply base at Balaclava. They had a line of forts running along some high ground, which were basically manned by the Turks. The Turkish soldiers in Crimea were not their best soldiers. They didn't send very good soldiers there for the most part. And these series of redoubts had a couple of naval guns in them, and a British NCO in charge, and some Turkish soldiers. Behind them was the cavalry division, with two camps, one for the heavy brigade, one for the light brigade. And then there was the 93rd Highlanders that was actually the last line of defense for Balaclava, and also some convalescent guys who were sick and recovering wounded guys from the Guards and some Royal Marines. And that basically was the defenses around Balaclava. Now, because the Russians could do pretty much what they liked in the interior of the Crimea, they were able to form a field army and attempt to capture the British supply base of Balaclava, which they did in October. They assembled a large force of infantry and also a large force of cavalry and a lot of artillery. The Russian army, then as now, was very much a pro-artillery army. They usually had a lot of guns. And they attacked these line of Turkish redoubts. The Turks put up a fairly good fight. The British artillerymen fired back with their naval guns, and when the Turks did eventually run away, largely because they were running out of ammunition, the British artillery NCOs spiked their guns so the Russians couldn't use them and fell back. At this point, the Russians sent a very large cavalry force towards Balaclava, and the British Heavy Cavalry Brigade was quite frustrated, as was the British Light Cavalry Brigade, because, as I said earlier, Raglan didn't trust the officers of the cavalry and thought that they would mess up. And so he had a lot of quite frustrated cavalry officers and men who, they'd been running patrols. They had to be up while it was still dark every morning. They'd been constantly skirmishing with Russian cavalry and Russian Cossacks, generally getting the better of it, it has to be said, partly because they had better horses. The British Heavy Cavalry Brigade, under a guy called Scala, who had never seen action, but he'd been quite sensible, and he had got as his ADCs, his aides, British cavalry guys who had fought in India and therefore had pretty recent experience. And when they saw this great big Russian cavalry force coming on, these guys were quick to say to Scala, we've got to charge these guys, because otherwise they're going to just walk into Balaclava. And although his heavy cavalry brigade was split up into several parts, Scala quickly sent orders to the various colonels of the British cavalry regiments to charge. And so the British cavalry, who included the Scots Greys and the 1st Dragoon Guards, etc., 6th Inniskilling Irish Dragoon Guards, Northern Irish Dragoon Guards, these guys, in various bits and pieces, charged this big Russian force. And the Russians were somewhat astonished by this. They didn't expect these small, isolated British cavalry forces to actually charge them, because they were in this big, dense column. And the guys were actually able to fight their way into the Russian formation. And people watching from the heights were able to see that, and the British heavy cavalry mostly wore red tunics, just like the infantry, because they were originally dragoons who fought on foot as well as on horses, although by this time they were total cavalry soldiers, but they were heavy cavalry. And they were able to see these red-clad British heavy cavalry brigade soldiers slowly fighting their way into these dense Russian formations. The British often found that their swords, which had not been kept particularly sharp, would sometimes just bounce off the Russian greatcoats. They wouldn't cut them. So quite often what the British cavalry would do is they would try and strike at the faces of the Russians, and even use the pommels of their swords to punch the Russians in the face. After a few minutes of this, and various British heavy cavalry units coming up from one direction and another, the Russians were quite disconcerted and started to retire, with the British chasing after them. However, before this force had been attacked, it had split off. About, I think it was 4 squadrons of cavalry had split off from it, and this group had got around the British heavy cavalry and was still heading for Balaclava. And all that stood in front of them was the 93rd Highlanders, famous Highland regiment. Sir Colin Campbell was their commander, who was also a Scotsman, the son of a carpenter, by the way, who was eventually to become Lord Clyde and was to be the main guy who put down the Indian Mutiny in 1857. A very good general. And he said to the 93rd, because he realized that if this Russian cavalry force got to Balaclava, it would basically capture the British supply base, and the British army would be cut off. And he turned around and told the Highlands, he said, 93rd, you must die where you stand, because he knew that these guys had to be fought off. Fortunately, the 93rd had the new Minet rifles. And as I say, these things were accurate out to 400 yards. And with 3 volleys, they were able to kill enough of the Russian cavalry that they stopped the advance and retreated. And at this point, all seemed to be going very well for the Brits. The charge of the Heavy Brigade had been very successful. The Thin Red Line, as it became known, of the 93rd Highlanders had been successful. More British infantry were marching down from the heights around Sebastopol to reinforce the Balaclava position. And it looked like Britain was going to have a nice, handy victory. However, Raglan was concerned that the Russians were going to try and capture the guns in the Turkish redoubts that they had earlier captured after, as I said, the British artillery guys had spiked them. The Russians, of course, could still hitch them up and take them away. And he did see the Russians sending forward some teams of horses and mules and what have you to take away these guns, because, you know, if you capture the enemy guns, it's a good thing. It's good propaganda and all the rest of it. And so he started sending orders that were not particularly clear down to Lord Lucan, who was the cavalry division commander. Lucan was the division commander. Scarlett commanded the heavy brigade, and Cardigan, as I already mentioned, commanded the light brigade. And he was sending orders down to Lucan. But what Raglan was forgetting was he was very high up on the Supani Heights. And whilst he could see the whole battlefield laid out before him, Lucan was down at ground level. And because these redoubts were on a road which was built along a ridge, Lucan couldn't see a lot of the things that Raglan could. So, you know, Lucan would send Raglan an opportunity, an order, which, because he was a polite old gentleman, was always, you know, kind of couched as a suggestion rather than an order. He would say, oh, the cavalry should try and prevent the Russians taking away the guns, etc. And Lucan would look at these orders that had come down from the heights and say, what Russians, what guns, where? Because he couldn't see them. So anyway, eventually these orders keep carrying on, and Raglan is getting more and more upset because Wellington didn't lose artillery in the peninsula. And because Raglan was always Wellington's student, he was becoming very agitated that the Russians might capture these British naval guns. And he wanted the light cavalry to go forward a bit and stop them doing it, which they could have done. Unfortunately, Lucan and Cardigan confused where Raglan wanted them to go. And to be fair, this was Raglan's fault more than it was Lucan and Cardigan. You know, Raglan had not specified what he was wanted them to do with sufficient clarity. And he had forgotten that because he was much higher up, he could see a lot of stuff that the British cavalry commanders could not. And because his orders had got more and more, the cavalry is to advance immediately, blah, blah, blah. And he got this guy called Lewis Edward Nolan, who was a British cavalry officer who thought that light cavalry could go anywhere and do anything, pretty much. He got him to take the order down. And this guy exaggerated somewhat what Raglan wanted him to do. I mean, Raglan shouted after Nolan, tell Lord Lucan that the cavalry is to attack immediately. But he hadn't actually ordered them to attack anything. He told them to advance. But anyway, there was a great deal of confusion. As a result, Lucan and Cardigan came to the erroneous conclusion that the guns Raglan wanted them to attack were down at the end of the North Valley, far further on than these guns that the Turks had been defending in the redoubts. And there were Russian troops on both sides of this valley on high ground. And for reasons best known to themselves, Lucan and Cardigan decided, right, well, those must be the guns that Raglan wants us to attack, even though it was suicidal, basically, to charge down this valley in between two lots of Russian infantry and guns to attack another load of guns. The guys were going to be under fire from three directions for most of the time. And the light cavalry brigade headed off first because they were a bit in advance of the heavy brigade. And then the heavy brigade carried on behind them. And initially, both brigades were going to take part in this charge. But fortunately, about a third of the way into the valley, Lucan decided, no, this is suicidal, and he stopped the heavy cavalry from carrying on. But the light cavalry had already carried on and ended up charging all the way down the valley. Initially, of course, they were trotting rather than charging to save their horses, but they were being fired on from both sides with rifles and muskets and also artillery. And also, of course, the Russians were firing artillery from the big battery of about 12 guns that they had at the bottom of the valley, which was the target that the light cavalry had set themselves. They did actually capture the Russian guns at the end of the valley. They sabred a lot of the gunners. They may or may not have spiked some of the guns. But after that, they didn't have enough men to keep them, and they didn't have any way of capturing them. So the guys had to withdraw all the way back down the valley, again, subject to fire from both sides. It wasn't quite as bad as it had been because some French cavalry had arrived, and they had attacked one of the Russian batteries and silenced it on one side of the valley. So they had a little bit less fire going back. The light cavalry brigade was very weak, even though it had 5 regiments in it, supposedly of 2 squadrons each. There were less than 700 men in the light brigade. I think it was 670 something altogether. They lost about 150 dead and probably 3 times that many horses killed or wounded. They also lost quite a lot of guys wounded. A lot of guys came back up the valley without their horses. The Cossacks killed quite a lot of guys who were unhorsed and were left at the mercy of these guys with big long lances and what have you. And that was the charge of the Light Brigade, which is probably the most famous thing about the Crimean War these days, partly because of Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem. His poem about the much more successful charge of the Heavy Brigade is far less well known. Anything you want to say about the Battle of Balaclava, Mitch?
I can't remember the details of the top of my head, but I remember the charge of the Light Brigade, it wasn't a complete failure as is sometimes thought about one thing about the Russians was they remarked that even they were wounded guys of the Light Brigade who were unhorsed, but they still fought against the Russians even to a point of death when Russian soldiers tried to take them prisoner. So even when unhorsed and having to be left behind, they didn't lack heart in their moments. But also, then you have what the Thin Red Line. The main reason why that was so successful was because the thing about the Russian army, like in terms of the cavalry and infantry, they were more trained on parades. The military science side of things, in terms of like in terms of being disciplined, in terms of like in terms of really being a capable, disciplined force dealing with a near peer enemy, they weren't as good as that. Like a lot of the manuals they were given was more for parades. So you'd have a situation where the cavalry, they'd be given orders to charge, but if you have something like these mini balls just tear into their ranks, they will get disheartened rather quickly, like quicker than people would anticipate, because of the fact that the Russian army for decades had been more focused on parades and more the aesthetics of the army rather than the actual rather than actually really training well in terms of fighting a near peer enemy. Russian artillery was Russian artillery and engineering was a complete different ball game. Like they were up to par with us in terms of engineering and artillery, especially when you look up siege of Sevastopol. But yeah, infantry and cavalry were not the strong suit. You also got the fact that a lot of Russian infantry, they did not know how to fire their muskets properly. So you'd have a situation where if you were to deal with a Russian soldier in melee, yeah, the average Russian soldier was probably better than your average British soldier for close quarters, especially when dealing with redoubts. However, you have, let's say, medium to long range. Yeah, you just have a situation where the mini rifle balls just tear into their ranks, and the Russians haven't really got much of an answer because even the guys do because even if they were trained on like even if every guy knew how to fire a musket, it wouldn't have done much. But also, yeah, a lot of Russian peasant soldiers just weren't really that well trained.
Yeah, fair enough. I think there's a great deal of truth in what you're saying there, Mitch. You're certainly right. The Battle of Balaclava did have some moral effect on the Russians. I remember one story was one of the light dragoons was captured, and he was a great big guy of about 6'4" and 14 stone or something. And the Russians turned around and said, "This guy is a light dragoon," because he was a big, great big guy. So the Russians were quite impressed by the bravery of the British soldiers. Initially, they thought that the Light Brigade were all drunk, and of course they weren't. I mean, I'm sure some of them had a drink, but most of them weren't drunk.
To be fair, there was cases where it's more of a siege of Sevastopol, but there were cases where you'd have certain soldiers on both sides who were just so drunk that they never spent a single minute of a war sober.
Possibly so, if they could get the drink, yeah, which would become a big problem for the British Army over the winter. But yes, but yeah, it did have a moral effect in terms of that on the Russians. However, the Russian army was relatively huge, and so after the Battle of Balaclava, which the charge of the Light Brigade probably turned into a draw, shall we say. If it hadn't have been for that, it would have been a British victory. But with the charge of the Light Brigade, it was probably a draw. And in fact, the British never reoccupied the line of forts that ran along this ridge that the Turks had been garrisoning. We built an inner line of defences and reinforced the 93rd Highlanders to the whole of the Highland Brigade were put there. So it was the battle ended up being a draw, I suppose, would be the fairest way of describing it. However, the Russians were by now pouring reinforcements into the Crimea, and in November they launched a much bigger attack, and this one was designed to wipe out the British Army, basically, and it was an attack on the Inkerman position. And Inkerman became very famous in British Army history back in the day because it was called the Soldiers' Battle. Much of it was fought in the fog, where guys couldn't see very far, and this actually worked to the British advantage eventually. Although initially, of course, it hid the Russian troops. And these massive, great Russian infantry columns were basically trying to advance onto the British position and wipe out the British army. And the British were fighting the battle initially with pickets, and pickets were little groups of soldiers who were there as sentries, basically. And we were the British army was fighting this battle with, you know, half companies, platoons, groups of like 50 guys, and they were firing on these dense Russian columns with thousands of troops in them. Now, the Russian columns weren't particularly effective because they were still armed with smoothbore muskets for the most part. And of course, the British Minet rifle fire was going into these columns and killing a lot of men. You know, one bullet would sometimes hit 2 or 3 guys. And the battle basically went on all day. I can't begin to really give you a description of it because it was a mess. It was little British forces meeting the Russian columns all over the place in valleys that were full of scrub oak and bushes, and there was no clear shape to it. British generals weren't really able to get a hand on it. If you want good descriptions of the Battle of Inkerman, the closest you will find is if you go to Rob's channel, British Muzzle Loaders, on YouTube. He has about 4 videos, I think, describing the Battle of Inkerman in some detail. And it's certainly probably the most detailed thing you will find on that battle anywhere, including in a book. You won't find anything much clearer. But I can recommend that, and I can recommend Rob's channel, British Muzzle Loaders, is an excellent channel. He's a Canadian chap of Scottish heritage, and all of his videos are excellent. But anyway, yeah, so the Battle of Inkerman was very messy. The British 4th Division got involved in it, and the British 4th Division was the only division that still had brown-breast muskets. But unfortunately, their commander, Cathcart, took his men down into a valley where they were shot to crap by the Russians, and he himself was killed. The British, eventually the Guards came up and fought a very long battle for a place called the Sandbag Battery. And this was a 2-gun artillery position made of sandbags, which is where it got its name. And the British and Russians, they exchanged. The British would capture it, the Russians would then capture it, the British would recapture it, the Russians would then capture it, the British would recapture it again. And after the battle, people said you could kind of look at how the fighting had gone by the layers of dead guys. You know, there'd be a layer of British infantry, then a layer of Russian infantry, then there'd be some guardsmen, then more Russian infantry, and very, very bloody fighting. And the ridiculous thing is, it was the battery itself was pretty useless because there was no guns in it, and it wasn't really a suitable infantry position. But a hell of a lot of guys ended up dying fighting for it. Eventually, some French troops came up under Bosquet, I think it was Bosquet, and his army of observation. And they came up and reinforced the Brits. And ultimately, the Russians were beaten back. There had been also what was called Little Inkerman, a battle about 2 weeks earlier, where a smaller Russian force had also been beaten there. But anyway, this was the last major British field battle in the Crimean War. And it was a victory, but it was also quite expensive. If you're ever in London, there is a big memorial to the Guards at the Battle of Inkerman that you can find, which is quite an impressive memorial. It's got big statues of guardsmen in their bearskins and what have you, because the Guards in the Crimea actually wore the uniform pretty much that you see them wearing when they're trooping the colour and so on, with bearskins and what have you. So yeah, the Battle of Inkerman was bloody and it was a mess, but the Russians were eventually beaten off at considerable cost because the British were so heavily outnumbered that even though the Russians were using muskets and we were using rifled muskets, we still lost a lot of guys. And then the Allies had been building up their siege lines. They'd been landing heavy guns from the ships and what have you. The sailors were also landed to man some of the guns. The French were also doing the same thing. And we started a bombardment of Sebastopol. But a Russian return shot hit a French magazine and blew it up about a few hours into the bombardment, and the French thereafter ceased fire, and the bombardment came to nothing, basically. And then the Russian winter took hold, and the winter of 1854-55 was a quite severe winter. And the British had not worked out a method of getting their supplies from Balaclava up onto the heights where the main siege army was surrounding part of Sebastopol. And so lots of supplies were landed at Balaclava, although Balaclava became very crowded because it was a long, narrow harbour. But these supplies were not getting up to the troops. Like the Highland Brigade that was camped defending Balaclava didn't do too badly and actually lost far fewer men than the other divisions that were up on the siege lines. The British had eventually landed tents for their men, but a lot of these tents were actually veterans of the Peninsular War and were very threadbare. So you can imagine that these were like big bell tents, and often they leaked because they were 40 years old. They'd last seen service in Portugal and Spain in the early 1800s. The British supplies weren't getting up to the troops, and part of the reason for this was that during the long peace between Waterloo and the Crimean War, most of the Royal Wagon Train, which Wellington had built up in the Peninsular War for carrying supplies for the army, that had been abolished. So the British literally had no supply force to supply their army. The individual battalions were supposed to send parties of men to go and get these supplies. And of course, the guys were becoming exhausted because they were in trenches in front of Sebastopol. And there was like daily and nightly skirmishing there. And, the guys didn't have proper winter clothing. They had a greatcoat and that was it, like a big overcoat, and that was it, pretty much. It snowed. There was ice. The supplies were not getting to the troops. Rates of sickness went through the roof. The British medical services, again, that Wellington had built up in the peninsula, had all pretty much been got rid of after the Battle of Waterloo. Individual battalions had their surgeons and a couple of surgeons' mates, and a few bandsmen who would act as stretcher bearers, and that was about it. Troops were wounded and sick troops were put on Royal Navy warships and taken back towards the Dardanelles and Constantinople. But the hospitals that they were put in were basically ex-Turkish barracks. They were mostly flea infested and rat infested, and the conditions were pretty terrible until eventually a volunteer lady called Florence Nightingale and a group of other women who were volunteer nurses managed to get themselves to the Crimea. And Florence Nightingale really invented modern nursing. I know that younger British people tell me that these days they go on about someone called Mary Seacole in Britain. Mary Seacole, who was a half West Indian lady, ran a hotel for officers at Balaclava. She was not a nurse. She was nothing like Florence Nightingale. She didn't achieve things like Florence Nightingale, and she only looked after officers who could afford her high prices. She also ran something of a brothel there as well. So Mary Seacole was in no way, in any shape, or form, like Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was the founder of modern nursing. Mary Seacole ran a hotel and a knocking shop for wealthy officers, basically. So not the same thing at all. Anyway, there was a big scandal in Britain because the Crimean War was probably the first war with a war correspondent. William Howard Russell from the Times was covering the battles. It was William Howard Russell who described the 93rd Highlanders at Balaclava, not in fact as the thin red line. He actually described them as a thin red streak topped with steel, but that became transliterated into the thin red line later on. But anyway, Russell was, of course, writing dispatches back to his newspaper and describing the terrible conditions of the British troops and the fact that lack of bad food, lack of supplies, lack of medical attention was killing far more of them than the Russians. And the British Army was really getting dangerously weak in the winter of 1854-55, and it was not as a result of enemy action. It was mostly just bad weather, bad supplies, bad medical attention. Like the troops were issued with a coffee ration, for example, but it was they were green coffee beans that the guys had no way of even grinding or breaking down. So anyway, the army was severely weakened over this winter, and in fact, most of the guys who had won the battles of Almar, Balaclava, and Inkerman, many of them either died or got sick over the winter and had to be replaced with new recruits. And as I said earlier, the British Army, because of the way it was organised as a long service army, they didn't have a reserve. So they were, perforce, they had to send these young 18 and 19-year-old boys with a limited amount of training out to the Crimea to reinforce the regiments that were out there, because that's all they had. And this would come back to haunt the British when the serious attacks on Sevastopol started again in 1855. Mitch, anything you would like to say about stuff that we're talking about here?
I know in the early stages of the war, you'd have a situation where, let's say, any news, like the Battle of Yalma, it took 5 days to get to London because you'd have to have a ship sail from Crimea to Varna in Bulgaria. I mean, you'd have to have a guy on a horse go to Bucharest in Romania because that was the nearest place with a telegraph.
Mm-hmm.
But then, because of underwater cables laid down, you then had a situation where it got shortened down to just a few hours later on in the war. And you also had was it like a small railway or something? I can't remember. I can't remember where it was.
Yeah. I'm going to come on to the British Railway at Balaclava because that was built for the following winter, if you see what I mean. It was built during the summer, but it was for the following winter. So
I thought they built it just. I thought they built it just after the first winter. I can't remember.
They built it after the first winter. That's the point. And what I've been talking about at the moment is the first winter. So I haven't really got to that bit yet. That will be the next thing we talk about. But if you want to talk about the railway, go for it.
Oh, I don't really know much. I just knew it was the other thing is, like, so you have the Russian side. At this point of the, I'm losing my train of thought. So you have the case of these battles where they're losing, and I think after Inkerman, because of a kill to death ratio quite being a bit like somewhat 3-1 or nearly that, it became a position where after that, you'd have a situation where the Russians didn't really want to do large scale battles after that, but still do raids from Sevastopol garrison, or they do raids on the besieging body. And you'd have, for example, let's say 5,000 attack on X day during the first winter, but it would never be enough to try and break the siege lines altogether. It was never in a position to actually relieve the place. So you'd have, like, let's say, 5,000 storming a particular redoubt that the French were holding. And the problem was basically Russians, they weren't able to coordinate their assaults, among other things. So you just had a situation where these raids don't go too well for the Russians, and it just becomes a position where problems compound. So as much as, the troops outside are suffering in the first winter, you've also got guys inside the city who all they can eat is just rotten beef, basically, from the corpses of oxen and cows that have died because of the winter.
Yeah, absolutely. About this time, Sardinia enters the war, and you might think, why the hell is Sardinia joining the Crimean War? Well, they were doing so because it was to do with Italian unification, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which included Sardinia, I think, they wanted to become the Italian royal family.
The kingdom was Sardinia Piedmont, because it was like
Piedmont, Sardinia. Thank you, Mitch. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're correct.
Yeah, I think his name was Camillo di Cavour or something like that. Basically, he was doing it because he tried to get on the good books on our side, and
yes, French. And particularly Napoleon III. And in fact, it works. I mean, Napoleon III ends up sending French troops to Italy and fighting the Austrians, and it was really as a result of the French help that Italy gets unified, and the Austrians are pushed out of most of northern Italy in the late 1850s. But that's why they send troops to the Crimea. They're looking to get influence with the Allies, and particularly with the French. By the spring of 1855, the French army was much larger than the British army. As I said, initially when the Allies landed in 1854, the British army was probably slightly bigger than the French army. It was probably about 25,000 men, and the French had about 22,000. By the spring of 1855, the French army was more like 60,000 strong, and the British army was probably about 18,000 because of the very heavy losses over the winter. Now, the Brits had put a number of things in train to fix this stuff, as always, too late, of course. But yeah, and part of that was they sent a load of Irish navvies to the Crimea, who built a railway from Balaclava up to the British positions on the heights around Sevastopol. And this railway meant that the next winter, there was no problem getting supplies up to the troops, and they were well supplied. And by the end of the winter, instead of 18,000, there were about 34,000 of them. But it didn't do them any good in the first winter. And the veteran soldiers who had fought so well at Almar, Balaclava, and Inkerman, these guys, many of them had gone and been replaced by young beardless boys, as the British officers were complaining, who hadn't seen any action, and the only action they'd seen was being in the trenches in front of Sevastopol. And when the Allies eventually got round to trying to storm the place, this was going to require these young boys to come out of these trenches and advance in the open against really fearsome Russian entrenchments with many guns, riflemen and musket fire and all the rest of it. There was another field battle at a place called Techinair Bridge, but the British didn't take much part in it. It was mostly the French and the Sardinians that fought it, and they fought off the final Russian field army attempt to interfere with the siege. British Light Cavalry Brigade was there, and I think there was a British artillery battery that took part, but basically the British army didn't really fight at the Battle of the Techinair. It was mostly the French and Sardinians who did pretty well. Anyway, by this time, the French are manning most of the siege works against Sevastopol. The British have a bit in the middle with Frenchmen on both sides of them. The main position that you had to capture to capture the bank, the side of Sebastopol that the Allies were besieging. The main position you had to capture was a thing called the Malakoff, which was a field fortification, basically, but it was a big, high field fortification with several rows of artillery, one above the other, and banquets that riflemen and musket guys could stand on. And in front of it, there was a big ditch, there was a big wall. There were abattis, which were collections of tree branches that had sharpened points, and they were used as a early form of barbed wire, basically. And they had these in front as well. This position the French were attacking, and in front of that was another position called the Mamelon. And until you captured the Mamelon, you couldn't even start attacking the Malakoff. The British had a similar position. They needed to capture a place called the Redan. And the Redan was like a three-sided fortification, again, with several levels, with at least 2 rows of artillery. Inside the Redan, there were also Russian mortars. There were positions for riflemen and musketeers. And again, they had entanglements in front of the position in the ditch and all the rest of it. And before you could attack that position, you had to capture a Russian position called the quarries, which were mostly a load of rifle pits and little trenches and things. And the Brits had to capture that before they could really attack the Redan. And the initial Allied assaults went quite well. The French managed to capture the Mamelon, although at heavy cost, and the British managed to capture the quarries and the rifle pits that the Russians had there. And then we were able to dig our trenches closer towards, in the French case, the Malakoff, and in the British case, the Redan. By the time of the next assault, for reasons that I've never understood, there were some British divisions, for example, the Highland Brigade and the Guards, who formed the Guards and Highlanders. By this stage, in fact, I think there was a Highland division by this time, because they'd had more regiments come out. These guys had a relatively easy time defending Balaclava, which was lower down, didn't get such bad weather as the heights around Sebastopol, and was also much closer to the actual supplies that were coming into Balaclava. And they had a high proportion of veteran soldiers as well, because they hadn't lost as many guys over the winter. But instead of using those guys, or one of the other divisions that hadn't seen so much action, Raglan insisted on still using the light division, which had very hard fighting and suffered a lot of casualties. They'd fought in all the battles except Balaclava, where they'd arrived too late. But they'd fought at Inkerman and lost a lot of guys. They'd fought at the Almar and lost a lot of guys, and they'd been fighting in the trenches and lost a lot of guys doing that. And they'd also captured the quarries and rifle pits position. But instead of bringing up a fresh division with more veterans in it, he decided he was going to use the light division and the second division again, who had done most of the fighting. And these divisions were full of these young new recruits who hadn't seen a lot of action, and what action they had seen had taught them that staying in trenches was a good thing, because it kept you out of the Russian fire. And when we assaulted the Redan, they needed to come out of these trenches. And frankly, a lot of them didn't. Some of these new young soldiers were most reluctant to leave the trenches. And when they did, went to ground very quickly. And you've got to understand that all these Russian guns are firing grape shot and canister at them, which basically turned a cannon into a giant shotgun. And so they're firing this. They've got rows of riflemen who are passing muskets and rifles to each other to the front, so they can keep up a constant fire. These guys were pinned to the ground. Not enough guys attacked, and the first British assault on the Redan failed, and so did the French assault on the Malakoff. That also failed.
Yeah, the problem
Um,
you had with the French was, I forget the guy's name, but basically, so the Russians, they knew off deserters that these assaults were coming. Like, they knew the time, place. We even knew like the exact composition of the regiments, and so they knew
mhm.
everything. You had a situation where a few Russian army officers, like, they actually snuck up to the French lines and just like and started just saying, "Oh, something along the lines of, "Oh, we know you're coming. Best of luck to you chaps," or something like that. Or they did something. They said something that spooked the main French guy commanding the assault, who was known to be quite aggressive. Like, he was a veteran of the Algerian wars. So when the French, so this one French officer, he attacks ahead of schedule by like 20 minutes, and his part of the assault just gets massacred. That unnerves the rest of the French force, who attack at different parts. They're not even ready. Like, they're thinking, okay, exactly at this time, they're not ready to attack at the same time as this early attack. So that's why the French, like the first French assault, fails because there was a lack of coordination. On the part of the British, that's purely it. Like, it's just you imagine you're like let's say you're a 20-year-old lad, and you're charging against a position which every Russian man knows what time, place. They even know what regiment you are, but they know everything. And you just got a position where you're storming up with reducers as well. The assault was always going to go, always exact. They're always going to make you pay a brutal, heavy price, even if you were successful.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anyway, the first Allied assault on Sebastopol was a disaster. Infernal in the chat is saying, did the Russians have reliable clocks at the time? Yes, the Russians had reliable clocks, for sure. Russia, in some ways, Russia was a bit backward in terms of industry and what have you, but it had most of the modern stuff that a modern European country or the USA had at the time. So yeah, the Russians certainly had reliable clocks. Anyway, Saint Honard, who'd been the original French commander, as I say, had cancer when he started the campaign, and he went home and died. He was replaced by Ken Robert, who wasn't aggressive enough for Napoleon III, who wanted to get this war over with. And so Ken Robert, in turn, was replaced by Pelessier. And Pelessier used to introduce himself by saying, "I'm that bastard Pelessier." So he was a bit of a downright swearing general, although he actually got on very well with Raglan, who was a completely different sort of man. And by this time, of course, the French were the major partner in terms of the land campaign. Before going on to the second Allied assault, I'll talk a little bit about the Baltic. The Brits started using more steamships in the Baltic. And in the second year, when the ice retreated in the spring, the Royal Navy were actually, and with their French allies, were quite successful in starting to capture Russian forts. They worked out how to use their warships, how to land French troops and Royal Marines, get behind the Russian positions and capture them. And they started to capture Russian forts fairly successfully. And in Britain, they were starting to build scores and scores of steam gunboats with quite big guns on, which would have been perfect for taking more of these Russian forts. And as 1855 goes on, the Russians become more and more concerned because they think they're going to lose Kronstadt, which is their main naval base and fort. But they also think that the French and British might land and capture St. Petersburg, which of course is the second town in Russia, second city in Russia.
Yeah, this actually caused problems for Russians as well, because they're having to deploy 200,000 men all over the Baltic. Now, the Russian army can only have 1 million men, because the Soviet economy is such that the Russians can't conscript too many, otherwise the economy falls apart. So you've got 1/5 of the Russian army who are not fighting anywhere near Crimea, but having to garrison all over the Baltic. And yeah, a lot of those guys are just, well, I won't say useless, but they're not exactly they're not going to be fighting because
And also the British were sounding out the Swedes, for example, if they'd like to join the war, because Sweden and Russia had a lot of rivalry up there, as you know, Mitch. They'd fought several wars.
Yeah, Finland was still at that time. The Swedish still claimed Finland as their land because they lost in 1809. And you still had Swedish aristocratic families who dominated the upper class of Finnish society. So there were plenty of people in Finland who wanted the Swedes back.
Yes, and so the Brits were diplomatically trying to get the Swedes on side. Napoleon III had actually sent quite a few French troops up to the Baltic, and the Royal Marines had been reinforced as well. So, as I say, the Brits and the French were starting to do quite well in the Baltic, and it was starting to really worry the Russian Emperor, and of course the Tsar changes at this time, roughly, doesn't he, Mitch? Yeah,
you had Tsar Nikolai. He dies of pneumonia because he went onto a military parade wearing a greatcoat, which some people reckon he vows he's kind of way committing suicide, because at that time, ever since the war started, he just got despondent and depressed. He thought, because you had Lord Palmerston, who wanted to dismember the Russian Empire. Nikolai thought he destroyed everything he built, he and his ancestors built in terms of Russian Empire. So,
and it was also the war was putting the Russians in quite a lot of debt as well.
Yeah, their deficit was 30% of GDP, because what's funny is so the Prussians would buy steam engines off us, but then they sell it to the Russians for higher than market price. So it's kind of it's a similar situation to how India is selling Russian oil, basically, but because it's sold by India directly, it's somehow not contravening as sanctions upon them. So
yeah, it was like the Russian rifles that they were using in the Crimea were Belgian copies of the British Brunswick rifle, which had been in use in the 1840s, but they were made by the Belgians. And the Russians would then buy them and equip their rifle regiments with them. But so the Russian economy is suffering. They're taking a lot of casualties. The Russians had quite a lot of supply problems of their own in the Crimea. I mean, obviously they couldn't supply the Crimea by sea. And finally, in 1855, an Anglo-French expedition was taken by the Allied fleets to Kerch, which is just off the map on the screen. And basically the Allied naval forces went into the Sea of Azov and went around destroying all the Russian bases and sinking all the Russian ships and gunboats in the Sea of Azov that had been taking supplies across to the Crimea and to Sevastopol. And this expedition was one of the nails in the coffin of the Russian position in the Crimea. The second assault was organized by Pelletier, the French commander. The French used a lot more troops, and this time the French used some espionage and what have you, and they had worked out when the garrison of the Malakoff was relieved. So the regiments holding the Malakoff, the Russian regiments holding it, at a certain time of day, they would march out and new regiments would march in to replace them. And the French had discovered when this happened from deserters and what have you. And the French timed their assault this time to be when those troops were changing, because that would lead to confusion. It would mean there wouldn't be a full garrison in there. The British couldn't do that in the Redan. And it was done at a different time anyway. And we had to, because we were the minor force relatively by this stage, the British attack on the Redan had to be at the same time as the French attack on the Malakoff. Now, the two positions, they were both very heavily fortified, but the position the French were attacking at the Malakoff was an actual fort, and it was like, sort of roughly round. And it had all-round defenses, whereas the British position that we were attacking at the Redan was open at the base, and this was to prove a disadvantage for the British. We did use slightly more forces for the second assault than we did on the first, but they were still a fraction of the numbers the French were using. And although the British army at this stage was a lot smaller than the French army in the Crimea, there were plenty of other British troops available. Again, there was the Highland Division, there was the Guards Brigade, there was the 4th Division, which hadn't seen much action since Inkerman. There were other troops the British could have used, but again, they used the Light Division and the 2nd Division with all these new young guys. Pretty much the same thing happens as on the first occasion. Some of the British troops do get into the Redan, not many of them, but some do. A lot get into the ditch in front of it. But because the Redan is open at the back, even the British troops who get there, there's nothing for them to hold to keep the Russians out. Whereas when the French get into the Malakoff, and as I said, they've done the timing of this attack very well, so that it was when the Russians were changing the garrison. The French, when they were able to get in, were able to hold the back wall against the Russians. And although the Russians launched several counterattacks to try and get it back, the French were able to use the back wall of the Malakoff as a position they could hold, which the British weren't able to do in the Redan. So the British failed to capture it, and it left a nasty taste in the mouths of British Army officers. That the final battles in the Crimea were actually not a success for the British Army. Mitch, anything you want to say about the Russian side of stuff?
Leo Tolstoy wrote about this in his book, where in his Sevastopol stories, where in the latter stages of the Sevastopol siege, it was a matter of, especially after Redan, like the Russian soldiers consider it a partial victory. So when the siege ends the way it does, a lot of the Russian soldiers are just like, was all our work in vain? Like there was a lot of anger about it because they felt that
sorry, Mitch, just to let people understand, if you held the Malakoff, as the French did after the second attack, you couldn't hold the Redan because the Malakoff dominated it. So even though the Russians had managed to hold it against the British assault, they still had to abandon it because otherwise they would have been shot up from the Malakoff. And the other thing was that the Malakoff, because it was on high ground, dominated the whole of that side of Sevastopol. And it basically meant that the Russians didn't have much option but to retreat across the bridge of boats they'd put between the two sides of Sevastopol across the harbour and dig in on the other side, which the Allies had never actually besieged at all. Sorry, Mitch.
Yeah, I might think so in the latter stages, you just have a lot of anger on the part of the Russians because they're just in that position where they feel that their sacrifices were all in vain, basically. A lot of good men died fighting on the Malakoff and the Marmaron and the Redan. And then you have later on, they're having to evacuate some areas of Sevastopol, which you got a factor that there's a lot of suffering in that place. Also, Russian military doctrine is all about, you don't retreat from land, you stand and fight, even and make the enemy pay dearly. That's one thing about Russian doctrine. So Sevastopol is seen as intrinsically Russian in the same way that Moscow or St. Petersburg are Russian. So the fact that they're having to give up ground without making the enemy pay dearly for it, or having to give up ground even though they made the enemy pay dearly for it, and they still feel like, yeah, this is one thing where in the last days of a siege, it really becomes a massive point of anger on part of not just the soldiers, but also the sailors, because a lot of the sailors were helping rigging the guns. As for the Baltic, you have, as I mentioned earlier, you have 200,000 Russians who are having to be stationed all over the place. That represents a massive debt. That represents a massive cost to the Russian budget.
It's also worth mentioning, Mitch, that there was another Russian army fighting the Turks as well at the same time.
Around cars, but I think that's. I'm trying,
That's right.
yeah, yeah, because they were besieging cars, and the thing was,
It held out
with
much longer than the Russians thought it would, largely thanks to some British officers who were leading the defense. But they did eventually capture it, but it took them quite a long time and cost them quite a lot of troops.
Yeah, the main reason it cost a lot of troops was because in the latter stage of siege, Tsar Alexander, after Sevastopol had fallen, he wanted a victory of his own, so that way he could come to the negotiating table and soften up what terms Lord Palmerston could do. So this is why.
Yeah, it was also unfortunate for the Russians that the Austrians at this stage were also making noises. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, as they then were making noises that they might come in on the Allied side.
Yeah, and they were stationing an army in Galicia, Volhynia, or Western Ukraine, and this was a point where the Russians also had to deploy another 200,000 men in that neck of the woods. So that further constrained logistics for the Russian army, because you got to factor there was even like Tsar Nikolai in his final moments, as well as Tsar Alexander. They were just saying at this point, they'd rather lose Crimea to the Allies than lose a single inch of Ukraine to the Austrians, because at this point, the Austrians very in that position where they wanted, because at this point the Russians were seeming like a threat to European stability, and they were wanting to speed up the end of the war and to get the Russians to the diplomatic table.
Yeah, by 1855, the Brits had actually sorted out most of their military supply problems and what have you. They had started raising a German legion of German volunteers, because this was a way of getting extra troops. And they were also sending new regiments to the Crimea. For example, 2 new cavalry regiments were sent out there. The Highland Brigade was enlarged to a Highland division, and other new British troops were going out there. As I said earlier, we were building all these gunboats mainly to operate in the Baltic, although some of them would have gone to the Black Sea. And Palmerston was quite keen to continue the war, but Napoleon III was not. Napoleon III wanted to stop. He'd lost a lot of guys, and the French army was actually in poorer shape than the British army in 1855, because cholera and typhoid broke out and started killing a lot of Frenchmen because they didn't have good ways of treating it back then. And the British army was actually quite a lot healthier than the French army in 1855 after the Russians had evacuated Sevastopol. And the British army was eventually 34,000 men strong, which was like bigger than it had been when it arrived, when it had been 25,000. It was still a bit smaller than the French army, but it was a lot bigger and quite a lot healthier. Florence Nightingale and volunteer nurses, and also British Army medical guys who'd been sent out there, had sorted out the hospitals back at Constantinople, and now British sick and wounded were quite likely to survive. The supply situation had been fixed. The railway was now working properly, running supplies from Balaclava up to what had been the siege lines. And the Brits were actually quite keen to continue the war. But as I say, Napoleon III was not. And also, as you correctly said, Mitch, the new Russian Tsar wanted to finish it as well. The Russian economy was in poor state. They lost a hell of a lot of guys, many of them from sickness and disease rather than from actual fighting. And most people wanted the war stopped. However, from the British point of view, it was quite successful, because Sevastopol, although it was allowed to continue as a Russian naval base, most of its defenses were slighted, which meant if you attacked it again, you'd capture it quite easily. And also, the Russians had to agree to keep their ships out of the Mediterranean. And in fact, no Russian ships went into the Mediterranean for 20 years after the Crimean War. So from 1856 until 1876 was when the Russians abrogated the treaty. So from the British point of view, the war was quite successful. Then, of course, the Indian Mutiny broke out in India, and this meant that the Brits were also keen to finish the war because we needed a lot of the troops in India. So, yeah, everyone was pretty much happy to end the war in 1856. Some things about it, it was the first war where the telegraph played a big role. As Mitch was saying earlier, eventually telegraph lines actually were laid into the Allied siege lines in the Crimea, which the French generals didn't like very much because it meant Napoleon III used to interfere with their orders all the time from Paris.
Another thing was, I forgot to mention earlier with the Baltic, naval mines were used for, because Alfred Nobel, like his father, worked for the Russian government at the time, and he set up the first land mines. I mean, not land mines, sea mines.
Yes, sea mines were quite a big deal in the Baltic, for sure. Also, it was the first war where steamships played a big part. It was the first war where most of the Allied infantry were armed with rifles, Minet muzzle-loading rifles, rather than muskets. Clossington in the chat, good evening, Clossington, correctly pointing out that there were ironclad floating batteries that were used at the siege of Sevastopol, particularly by the French, actually. They weren't warships yet, they weren't powered, but they were clad in iron, as Clossington points out, and they were used to bombard Sevastopol from the sea. And it wasn't very long after this that the French got the idea, okay, well, why don't we armor our warships? And so you had Gloire, for example, which was a wooden warship that the French put iron armor around. And that in turn led to the world's first iron battleship, which was HMS Warrior, that was launched in 1860. So only 4 years after the end of the Crimean War. Other things from the Crimean War, the cardigan actually gets its name from the Earl of Cardigan. The raglan overcoat is a thing. And of course the balaclava, because these things were knitted in England and sent out to the troops for the winter. In the winter of 1855-56, by the way, the British troops had proper winter clothing, and you can find a lot of Roger Fenton photographs of British troops in the Crimea, and they're mostly taken in 1855 and 1856. And you see the guys wearing these enormous sheepskin jackets and what have you. And this stuff was all out there for 1856. So conditions had hugely improved. And also huts were built for the troops to replace the tents that the guys had froze to death in the winter of 1854-55. So conditions had vastly improved. A lot of troops died in the Crimean War. Something like over 20,000 British troops died, and the vast majority of them died from disease and exposure rather than enemy action. A lot more Russians died, and rather more French. But from the British high policy point of view, it was successful in that it kept the Russian Navy out of the Mediterranean for 20 years. And the next time this became an issue was during the Russo-Turkish War in 1878, which of course led to the Congress of Berlin. And I'm sure we will do one of these streams on the Congress of Berlin one day, hopefully with Aaron Hook, because that's that politics stuff's his bag as much as anything else. Mitch, any final thoughts and what have you?
Firstly, I thought in terms of steam warships, I thought steam warships started becoming a thing in reference to the First Opium War, because I think of HMS.
Yeah, they were around in the 1840s for sure, Mitch, but the Crimea was the first major war they were used in. It was also the first war where shell guns were a major thing. But yeah, the China wars in the 1840s had seen steamships in action, but the Crimea was the first big war that had a lot of steam battleships. The wooden ships of the line were still a thing in the Crimea, but most of the best ones had steam engines.
Yeah, and in terms of a Russian point of view, I mean, so for example, in 2006, for example, you had 150th anniversary of the Crimean War ending. You had Putin. So, for example, Putin, he considers himself to be inspired by Tsar Nikolai I, who was a Russian emperor at the start of the war. So, in terms of like why the Russians are so strongly identifying with Crimea to this day, and why they were so keen to have it back in 2014, it's stuff like this. Like they are very emotionally connected to it. As not
I've
just
seen videos, which of Russian reenactors doing Crimean War stuff in the Crimea, like reenactors in period uniforms and stuff like that. It's quite cool, actually.
Yeah. One thing that, secondly, one thing that drew, thirdly, I should say, another thing that drove us to commit to peace was so some of the stuff that Lord Palmerston tried to do to undercut the Russians, he was advised not to do. Like, for example, Imam Shamil. The problem with Imam Shamil was there were some people around him who were basically just like ISIS tier type of people. They just wanted like a Caucasian caliphate and just wanted to like ethnically cleanse the Christians in that area. And of course, people around Lord Palmerston said to him, "Yeah, you don't want to egg on these people." So that's one, because Lord Palmerston famously wanted to dismember the European side of the empire. Like, for example, he wanted to recreate an independent Poland, which you got a factor. We're trying to give the Prussians on side. Well, it's not going to give the Prussians on side if you've literally created Poland all over again, because it's not just because that would actually screw over our policy of trying to isolate the Russians at this point. But another thing that, so you have the peace treaty now that gets eroded over time because basically Napoleon III, he works with the Russians against the Austrians in terms of Italian unification. So then you have the case. Then in 1877, you have a situation where we tell the Russians, "Okay, calm down on some of the stuff you want to do with the Turks, and we'll give you access. We'll give you permission to have a Black Sea fleet again." Now that was Tsar Alexander in 1877. In a way, he avenged the defeat because he avenged it on the Turks, and he managed to diplomatically negotiate for a Black Sea navy to be built once again in 1877.
Could I just say to people, go and check out Clossington's channel, guys, that guy in the chat. He had me on as a guest. I was happy to be a guest on one of his streams. And he does quite a lot of maritime or broadly maritime themed streams. So go and check that out. Sorry, Mitch, carry on.
The other thing is, so one thing that is a bit of a dark topic, and it's a bit dark of Russian Crimea at this time during the Crimean War had a Crimean Tatar majority who were just a massive pain in the arse for the Russians. Basically, they would work with us against them, but
yes, they did. I didn't mention it when I was talking, but yeah, the Crimean Tatars tended to favor the Allies during the Crimean War. That's true.
Yeah, because Crimean Tatars, they speak a language that's pretty much intelligible to Turkish. I think the Crimean Tatars have largely assimilated into the Turkish fold in terms of the ones that went there. After this war, the Russians step up their effort to make Crimea as Russian as possible. So you have some places like, for example, Feodosia. It used to be in the Crimean Tatar, it's called Kefa, but that's an area where they just got rid of it.
Because originally the Crimean Peninsula had been Turkish, hadn't it?
Yeah, basically, it used to the Crimean Khanate. They were ruled over by the Giray dynasty, and they were descended from Genghis Khan. So, and they were known for slave trade, basically, like they deal with the slave trade into Poland or Ukraine or Russia, and sell and that's why the word slave comes from the word Slav, because the Turks in this area dealt a lot of slaves raiding Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, which is
After
partly what caused the Russians to eventually occupy it and kick the Turks out.
Yeah, and after this war, especially because of the Crimean Tatars literally trying to ethnically cleanse a place while we were in the peninsula. This is why Crimea is like 80% ethnically Russian these days.
It has to be said that the British soldiers and Royal Navy sailors in the Crimean War were not desperately keen on the Turks for the most part. A lot of them said they would have sooner been fighting against the Turks than with them.
Yeah, there was a famous anecdote I was reading earlier where there was this British, French, and Russian soldier. So the Russian couldn't speak a word of English or French. The French could speak some English, and the Russian could speak slightly a bit of French. But basically, the Englishman goes, Turks, no bono. And then the Russian does a gesture with his rifle saying he wants to shoot the Turk. And the British soldier is like, yeah, like pretty much going, yes, that's bono, as in, yeah, I agree with you. I don't, like, no, I think like, so basically, yeah, everyone on the Allied side and on the Russian side, we all unite. Weirdly, we all agree at the same that we don't like the Turks.
Yep. Yeah, the Turks were not at all popular with the British soldiers and officers. They just weren't. There's also at the Battle of Balaclava, when the 93rd were doing their stand against the Russian cavalry, some Turks who were there ran away again, running into the port to try and get on a ship. And there was one or two of the Highlanders' wives who had been allowed to accompany their men. They like 6 wives were allowed to go with every company, and they would do a lot of the laundry for the soldiers and also some of the cooking and what have you. And at least one or two of these Highland ladies were going along with clubs, hitting the Turks who were running away and leaving their blokes behind to face the Russian cavalry. So yeah, the Turks were not desperately popular with the British.
Yeah, I can't remember what it's like Yardana or something. I can't remember. It was either an Arabic or Turkish word. Well, basically, they were calling these British women who were throwing rocks at them. They were calling them. Essentially, the word means prostitute or woman of the night, and he was like, apparently, when the British women found that out, because you know. When a word like that, like swear words, are the first words you learn in the language. That was a point where the British women were literally chasing them, apparently.
Yep, yeah, the Turks were not popular allies, shall we say. The Sardinians were quite well liked, and they fought pretty well at the Battle of the Techenaya. But yeah, the Turks were not popular. Anyway, we've been going for well over 2 hours. Is there anything you would like to plug, Mitch?
Nah, not for me. I mean, I don't know what will be the topic for next week. One thing I'm probably going to look into is Opium War, because I'm probably after I'm done with the Russian books I've got on my bookshelf, I'll probably learn some to do with Chinese history.
Well, we can
Opium Wars.
We can most definitely do the Opium Wars. I'm also happy to do the Congress of Berlin, which can also include the Russian-Turkish War of the 1877-78. So we'll probably do those at some point. I think next week, but this will depend on Hitman, because I'm sure not going to do a stream on the Middle East unless Hitman's going to join. But if he's free next week, we'll probably be doing Oman and the British involvement in Oman in the late 1960s and the 1970s, which is quite interesting. Includes quite a lot of fighting by the British Army, including the Parachute Regiment and the SAS, and also stuff about the Sultan of Oman and what have you, and the British British officers who are seconded to run his army even to this day. And so we'll be doing that. Woodpit 420 in the chat says War of 1812. We will definitely do the War of 1812. I can't say when yet, but we will definitely do the War of 1812, and I'll even try and get an American to come on for that one.
The only thing about War of 1812 is I don't know what. I mean, I'd be open to doing that. I'm just thinking, I don't know what sources to read for that, because from what I see, it's a lot of the sources I see online in terms of books or documentaries is literally just Americans, and I don't
yeah, most of them are. You're right. I can do the naval side of the War of 1812 quite well, but I'm going to need to research more about the land side of it. But yeah, we will do the War of 1812 undoubtedly. As I say, we'll do the Congress of Berlin, and when we do that, we'll cover the Russian-Turkish War of the 1878. Quite happy to do the Opium Wars whenever you want, Mitch. When you want to do those, you just tell me when you're ready to do it. My problem with these streams is that I want to try and get us at least 2 weeks ahead, which we pretty much are at the moment. And I want to keep us that way, because that way I can publicize them, and also in many cases do some research myself, because like the Crimean War is one of the things I'm able to talk about without doing research, just because I've done it before. You know, I've been interested in the Crimean War since I was a boy, so I know more about it than is probably healthy for me. But other subjects, obviously, I have to research, and so as I say, I want to keep our historical streams planned a couple of weeks ahead. As I say, next week, as far as I know, will be Oman and British involvement in Oman, mostly in the 1970s, and that will be with Hitman and whoever else wants to come on. I mean, obviously, Mitch and Aaron Hook, etc., are always welcome. Yeah. So we will be back on Saturday with our normal Splendid Isolation stream. I'm happy to say our stream over the weekend on the Restore Britain special that we did has been pretty popular. It's got quite a lot of views, quite a lot of likes, so I'm happy about that. In the meantime, don't let the bastards grind you down, and I'm going to play us out with a bit of a tune if it works. See if it does. Hopefully. And that was I'm 95, which is a quick march of the 95th, or the Rifle Brigade. And as I pointed out early in the stream, the Rifle Brigade, both battalions at the time of the Rifle Brigade, fought in the Crimea. And that was from Patriotic Archive. If you like military and naval music, and also folk music, traditional European stuff, some American stuff as well, do go and check out Patriotic Archive. He's a friend of the channel and a member of my Discord, and a good chap. Thank you so much to my guest this evening, Mitch, and we'll see you on Saturday with our normal Splendid Isolation stream. Go well, guys. I didn't check. Hang on.